What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. With me tonight is my guest, James Lardner, who wrote an exhaustive report for the American Prospect entitled Mapping Trump's Corruption. How you doing tonight, Jim?
Good, thank you. Pleased to be here.
Well, I'm going to read a little bit from your report and then we're going to get right into it. Oh, first I should say that you are a journalist and a political activist in Washington, D.C. So you wrote, quote, Trump has sowed corruption of a breadth and brazenness unseen in the far from innocent annals of our nation's history. In 3 years as president, he has transformed the executive branch into a giant favor factory populated with the agents or willing partners of virtually every special interest. We lunge from scandal to scandal without ever filling in the bigger picture or taking proper account of all the knaves, thieves, and corporate stooges and their handiwork. Hard, but worth doing, an undertaking commenced here and continued and expanded online at prospect.org/mappingcorruption, with an interactive agency by agency exhibit of the major offenses thus far committed. Only by traveling to the far corners of this swamp, looking through the muck, and drawing up a map of the territory, the stories both known and unknown, can we begin to understand our times. Well, first of all, I really like the way you write. It's very accessible and easy to read. Tell us how long this undertaking took, why you decided to take it on, how you decided to organize it, and did you have any help?
Okay. It took me a couple of months of work, and I pitched the idea to David Dian, the editor, and others at the American Prospect magazine, and they agreed toward the end of last year to support it. And so I had the help of not only their editors, but also their art director, Jandosh Rothstein, and Peter and Maria Hoey, who were the designers who designed the interactive map of Washington. And my motivation, I guess, was that I think that plain old money corruption, inside favors, handouts is the kind of core story of this administration, of the Trump gang and of their partners who enable them in Republicans in Congress. And it's a story that is easily lost sight of. We got, 2 years of nearly of the Trump administration got consumed, 2 successive mighty official investigations, which were both looking halfway around the world for the one damning instance of corruption, when all the really, really obvious damning stuff was right here at home. And not only were we distracted by this effort to find a story involving Russia or Ukraine that would somehow crack the walls of the political fortress protecting this president, but we were also distracted by the personal crimes of the Trumps themselves, from the routinized massive corruption of the gang of people they have brought into Washington to run their government for them.
I was saying, and I did a show back in the spring of 2017, that he needed to be impeached on the emoluments clause, and that this Russiagate thing was a complete distraction, and that they should have done the impeachment on all of these things that he has done to harm people and the planet in this country. So what you have outlined here, I was so pleased to see it, because hopefully they can still run on this, in the general election. Who knows if they will? We can talk about that later. But why don't we start off by talking about specifically how Trump's businesses have benefited?
Well, the most obvious dimension of that is massive, and this is this president is in the so-called hospitality business. We've never had such a president in that line of business before, and as a result, supplicants of all kinds, foreign diplomats, corporate leaders of the country, people of stripes all around the world have taken to staying at Trump properties while they're en route to visits with Trump officials seeking favors. And a tremendous amount of money, Lord knows how much, has been pumped into the Trump organization in this fashion. There's also been a huge amount of money, once again, as yet uncountable, that has gone to pay for civil service, Secret Service agents, forgive me, staying at Trump properties, in Trump properties, again, all over the place, including not just in the Mar-a-Lago and the Doral Golf Club and Bedminster in New Jersey, and the Scottish Golf Club, but also, oddly enough, the Trump Hotel in Washington. Why we have Secret Service agents spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to stay at the Trump Hotel in Washington is a mystery that the Secret Service has yet to answer, since presumably the Secret Service agents live in Washington.
Well, I remember that he was saying that he was giving them a discount on his hotel rooms, and then it turns out he actually wasn't. You mentioned two other industries that are benefiting. Can you speak about the private prison industry and the payday lending industry?
Yeah. At the tail end of the Obama administration, in August of 2016, the Justice Department decided, after many scandals involving private prisons and the either federal prisoners or immigrant detainees they were responsible for, to phase out the use of private prisons. The private prison industry acted immediately, threw money at the Trump campaign. This was August 2016, and has since that time has given the Trump inauguration and the Trump 2016 campaign over $2 million. And since the time that the Trump administration took over, it's been a sort of revival of good times for the private prison. There was a headline in USA Today: America's private prisons appear to be entering a golden age. Two private prison companies, the two giants of the industry, Geo Group and Core Civic, they run between them 41 facilities with more than half of all the detainees who are held in custody by ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Unit of the Department of Homeland Security. So the Department of Homeland Security has been a windfall for the private prison industry.
And payday lenders?
Yeah, it's kind of a parallel story in that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau at the end of the last administration had just completed, after years of work, new policies for short-term consumer loans, including payday loans, that would have made it difficult or impossible for payday lenders to continue with the slimiest part of their whole program, which is to get people hooked on debt that is advertised as a single emergency loan that you pay back with a fee of $15 or $25 a couple of weeks later, but which, if you can't pay it back, ends up being a long-term loan at 300 or 500% interest. And the payday lending industry's fortunes looked pretty bad at when this rule was finalized by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. But to the rescue came once again the Trump administration, and Mick Mulvaney, the former head of the Office of Management and Budget, who was designated to run the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau on top of it, that other job. This is all before he became the White House Chief of Staff. He was a ideological, fervent opponent of consumer financial regulation, period, didn't believe that bureau should exist. And the minute he arrived, he began unraveling that new regulation, calling off all enforcement actions. And by the way, one of the biggest payday lending companies in the land is headquartered in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which is part of his former congressional district. So there you have a similar pattern. And the payday lending industry, in addition to all the money it directly sent to the Trump campaign and inaugural, has also held 2 years worth of its annual conventions at the Doral Golf Club to the tune of $1 million or more.
Yeah, and it is often said that personnel is policy. So can you go through the former industry execs that are leading the agencies that they're supposed to be regulating and give the most egregious examples of how they have helped their former employers?
Yeah, first of all, let's talk about the agencies. There's never been an administration with so many foxes running so many hen houses. You've got a pharma executive, a former pharma executive in charge of health and human services, an oil lobbyist in charge of the interior, a Raytheon lobbyist running the Defense Department, a telecom lawyer chairing the Federal Communications Commission, an ex-Goldman Sachs lawyer who's also married to an ex-Goldman Sachs executive, heading the Securities and Exchange Commission, another ex-Goldman Sachs partner, Steve Mnuchin, Secretary of the Treasury, a shipping heiress running the Transportation Department, a private equity tycoon at the Commerce Department, a former auto industry lobbyist running the Energy Department. That's a good starter list.
And talk about how they have, maybe just give one or two examples from each agency, how they've helped enrich the industries they've supposed to be regulating, or maybe alternatively, removed regulations or stopped enforcing regulations.
One of the most egregious involves the Department of Education, where Secretary Betsy DeVos has been a crusader for what she calls school choice, and in particular for religious private schools and for the right to divert public funds into those schools. And she has had many connections with for-profit colleges and has hired a whole bunch of alumni of the executive ranks of for-profit college companies to hold high positions in the education department. And since she took over, you've seen, first of all, more or less the end of the Obama administration's effort to cut off the flow of federal funds to private education companies that were routinely scamming their students, falsely advertising the jobs they could get, the money they could earn with their degrees, and leading many students to wind up heavily in debt without any credentials of any value or education of any value. So that policy has been reversed. And then, in addition, Congress enacted a public service loan relief program under which, if you have a lot of student loan debt and you go to work as a police officer, a teacher, a nurse, an EMT person, and so forth, you're supposed to have your loans forgiven. And there are estimates of as many as 100,000 people, I don't know there are precise numbers, who would qualify for this relief, but only a very small number of people have actually gotten it. And once again, you have not just executives of for-profit college companies in high positions at the Department of Education, but also some ties to the private lending industry there as well. So that's been a complete betrayal of the public trust. And the Interior Department, I think, would be another outstanding example. There you have the Secretary, David Bernhardt, who is a ex-lobbyist for various extractive industry companies. His former law and lobbying firm has experienced a quadrupling of its revenues since Bernhardt arrived in Washington, and he had the most conflicts of interest, 20 plus, of any member of the Trump administration, so many that he proudly carried an index card with all of them on the index card, I guess, to remind him, but it doesn't seem to have stopped him from participating in a number of decisions that have resulted in benefits for former clients, in addition to just a general bias in favor of handing out oil drilling rights on the cheap and so forth.
Well, I want people to go to the map and use the tool to pick the agency of their choice. But can you just give us a couple more examples, maybe with Wilbur Ross in commerce or Sonny Perdue in agriculture?
Wilbur Ross illustrates, I think, another pattern of the Trump administration. I mean, there's the kind of corruption we're talking about. There are versions of it that are very old in this country, and versions of it in which the Democratic Party is complicit along with the Republican Party. But this administration has really taken it to new levels. One of the things it's done is that it's not just hiring corporate leaders to run agencies that are supposed to oversee their own industries and their own companies, but also reaching down into the slimiest levels of corporate and financial America. Wilbur Ross is someone who for decades has made a living by buying up holdings in troubled companies with a lot of debt, then sort of negotiating away as much of the debt as possible, often walking away from pension and health obligations, and then selling off companies on the cheap. And he's had investors over the years, many of whom have complained about having been cheated out of some of their rightful earnings. The Securities and Exchange Commission a few years ago, in a case it brought against Ross, calculated some $10 million in funds that had been skimmed from investors, and he paid a fine or a settlement of a few million on that. In that case, Forbes magazine has described him as one of the biggest grifters in American history. The Forbes reporter found over $100 million in kind of skimmed fees, and Ross is an example, and there are plenty of them in this administration, of a cabinet officer who has done favors for the president, been very careful to serve the needs and whims of Donald Trump, and has in return been able to do a lot for himself. He's negotiated with China on deals involving natural gas while he held an interest in a natural gas shipping company, and he met with officials of Ford and I forget what other company when his wife held large stakes in those two companies. So that's a pretty appalling example. And who else did you ask me about?
I asked you about Sonny Perdue, the agriculture secretary.
As governor of Georgia, he's one of a number of people who have past transgressions on their records that might, in a better or even a normal administration, have been some barrier to service. He benefited to the tune of I think, $100,000 from a tax bill that retroactively saved him that much on a land sale that had already completed before the tax bill was enacted in Georgia. And the legislators involved the push for that tax bill, personal lawyer of Purdue's. And in general, there's the Department of Agriculture has been kind of an agribusiness outfit under this agriculture secretary. Small farmers dairy farmers in the Midwest and have complained that they haven't gotten their rightful share of the subsidies that the federal government was supposed to be sending their way as relief for the pain of the China trade sanctions, for example.
Do you think that the Democrats have done all they could to push back on some of these appointments? I mean, I know a lot of them have to be confirmed, and people were criticizing Democrats for confirming some of these people. But then he got very canny and he decided to appoint acting heads of agencies and not even put them through a confirmation process.
To me, the real area of neglect has been oversight and calling out the crimes and misdeeds of this crew of people. And the story of the 2017 tax cuts and the various Trump cronies and Trump-friendly industries that benefited disproportionately from that bill there should have been massive hearings on that. It's true, though, that quite a few Democrats took the attitude that, well, he should get the appointees he wants and wouldn't, so he got Betsy DeVos and Steve Mnuchin. To hire as Treasury Secretary someone who, and you're coming to me from Southern California, where Mr. Mnuchin's bank held a lot of properties, a lot of mortgages. Someone who, first of all, got rich on private label mortgage securities, the very kind of product that did in the economy 10 years ago. And second of all, got even richer by buying a bank on the cheap after the financial crisis hit, and then using federal subsidies that in theory were there to help people hold on to their homes. But meanwhile, his company was foreclosing on 30,000 plus homes, including some just horrendous cases of, an elderly person who missed her payment by 30 cents or something.
Well, we can thank Kamala Harris for him because she was urged by her office to prosecute him. And he had donated to her attorney general campaign. And when she did not prosecute him, he donated to her Senate campaign. So that one is on Kamala. Otherwise, we could have put him away. Now, you also referred to how many lobbyists are working in his administration. Can you give us the number of lobbyists and how that compares to the Obama administration? And also talk specifically about how they have impacted the Environmental Protection Agency, which to me is the most egregious of Trump's crimes, because these things impact our climate crisis, and much of what he's doing is very difficult to reverse once it's been put into motion.
ProPublica attempted a count, and it's not that recent, so this is only ballpark. They counted 280 plus lobbyists in the Trump administration, and they said that proportionately it was about 14 times as great as the number of lobbyists in the Obama administration. I think that's right. While we're going on, I'll double check my numbers here. You're right about the Environmental Protection Administration. You just look at the resumes of a lot of the top people there, and it's just one chemical company or extractive industry company after another, or the American Chemistry Association, which is the chemical industry's main trade group, has had something 5 or 10 different alums at the EPA. And one of their people, Nancy Beck, who is, I believe, I don't know if she's been confirmed yet. I think she's slated to become the head of the Consumer Product Safety Commission. She was in charge of enforcing toxics rules, had a pretty abysmal record at the EPA. The EPA has, like a number of these other agencies, has gone lower down the ladder, replacing professionals with political hacks or former lobbyists, so that the professionals are totally dispirited. Some of them have been scared into retiring. And I think that this pattern we're talking about, which is also can be seen at the Department of Health and Human Services, explains a lot about our lack of preparedness for a pandemic too, that people who wanted to sound the alarm were either no longer had the position from which they could do so, or were too scared to do so.
Now, you have a section in your article about how Trump's appointees have helped him personally through some of his travails. You specifically list Barr, Mnuchin, and the head of the Department of Homeland Security. Can you go into that?
Sure. Well, Barr is pretty obvious, and he's kind of out there about it, but he of course produced that Mueller report summary, which was a distorted summary of part of the report, and kept the real thing under wraps for another month after his announcement. And he has also, his Justice Department, or the Justice Department, both under him and under his predecessor, has been highly enthusiastic about some mergers that benefited media companies that are pro-Trump. Mnuchin has kept the Trump tax returns under wraps. We learned eventually that IRS lawyers, after studying the rules, concluded that they really had no choice but to turn over Trump's tax returns if requested by Congress. And Steve Mnuchin, according to the New York Times, overruled that. He also had a hand in making sure that the Opportunity Zone tax credit could be advantageous to a whole bunch of Trump cronies, including Anthony Scaramucci and Chris Christie and Lefrak, the real estate guy, and Michael Milken. Just shortly after Mnuchin attended one of these glitzy conferences that Milken holds, he played a role, Mnuchin did, in helping Milken become another potential beneficiary of the Opportunity Zone tax credit. And later we know he was one of the advocates who helped Milken get his pardon from Trump. And in the favor department, another big one would be Wilbur Ross, coming up with a badly needed but completely fabricated pretext for putting a citizenship question on the census form, which was pretty obviously done to intimidate non-English speakers and people who might have undocumented people in their families or households from registering, from answering the census and therefore being counted. But when the courts needed an explanation for that, the Commerce Department came up with one, and even the United States Supreme Court, this United States Supreme Court, found the explanation that Ross's people produced completely unbelievable.
Can you talk about the Department of Homeland Security guy, what he did?
Well, for one thing, they do events all the time that celebrate the wall, and their events are almost like TV commercials for Trump and his anti-immigrant campaign. And then there's been an incredible flow of former Department of Homeland Security officials into the private prison industry and into the employment of various other companies that have contracts with the Department of Homeland Services.
Okay, I want to read another passage from the end of your article to discuss with you. Since the beginning of his presidency, Donald Trump has managed to fend off 2 long official inquiries, one going as far as impeachment. Now that the goal is to win an election, some investigation-weary Democrats are counseling their party to go easy on the attacks and the whole subject of corruption, to concentrate on kitchen table concerns and accentuate the positive in order to appeal to a small but theoretically crucial bloc of Trump-susceptible swing voters in swing states. Democrats must summon the courage, most importantly, to make the leap from denouncing Trump's over-the-top personal corruption to acknowledging and challenging the more generic and abiding money corruption that, with or without Trump, gives billionaires and rapacious corporations and financial interests way too much clout at incalculable cost to the rest of us and the idea of democracy. So you and I are in agreement about this, but why do you think the Democrats have been so resistant to doing this?
Well, there's the unilateral disarmament theory, which I have some sympathy for. I wouldn't want to be an incumbent member of Congress running against a Coke industry funded opponent and all of a sudden announce that I am going to not take any money from any industry. So there's that. But I think that there are 2 things that are going on here. One, there's sort of investigation fatigue after all the 2 big corruption scandals. There was the hope that not only would public opinion turn radically against Trump, but even Republicans in Congress would turn against Trump. And the disappointment of that led people to make, I think, the erroneous conclusion that corruption was not a potent issue. Corruption is a hugely potent issue. Corruption involving the Ukraine or Russia, maybe not, but the kind of corruption we're talking about has a track record of resulting in wave elections in this country. 1974, after Watergate, when the Democrats won a huge victory. 2006, and indeed 2018. 2018, we had all the stories about Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen and so forth had been fresh in the news, and the Democrats won a huge victory in terms of the popular vote, a really massive victory. And Nancy Pelosi actually later concluded that corruption had been perhaps the overriding issue that accounted for that victory in 2018. And that happened despite the lack of a concerted effort by the party to emphasize the issue of corruption. In fact, a lot of the talking points coming out of the Democratic Party leadership in the final weeks and months of the 2018 campaign were just about healthcare, just protect the Affordable Care Act. But some of the most notable victories were won by candidates who campaigned on strong anti-corruption platforms. And we remember it as a time when it was the so-called moderates who actually, the moderate Democrats who accounted for the victory margin. But what is forgotten is that some of those, quite a number of those so-called moderates, took actually quite radical, strong positions on the subject of corruption, PAC money, revolving door, hiring lobbyists, that kind of thing. And indeed, this is an issue where there really is no divide between radical and moderates. If Joe Biden, for example, were worried, or his people were worried, that if they go too far on a Green New Deal, or they go too far on Medicare for all, that they are somehow going to lose their moderate supporters, or some of their moderate supporters, and so it won't be a good move. They need have no such fear on the issue of corruption. He could take, the party as a whole could take a much stronger position on corruption than it ever has, and only win votes, because most Republicans in this country, polls show, favor extremely strong reforms when it comes to money in politics. And the House of Representatives very shrewdly passed a pretty good bill called H.R. 1 as its first symbolic act of its majority in the beginning of 2019. So they've got this bill, which has strong measures in it. Elizabeth Warren has a strong anti-corruption bill. If in coordination, the candidate and the party, all the other candidates running to keep the House and gain the Senate made an obsessive issue of corruption and continued to hold oversight hearings and said, the rules in Washington are going to be different if you vote for us. It could be a much more potent issue this time around than it was in 2018. And while Joe Biden at first glance doesn't seem like the most likely anti-corruption crusader, actually he could be a fine anti-corruption crusader, because he could say, I've been in this political world for 40 years, and I've been promising you all that I'm going to bring you back responsible, honest, caring government, restore the soul of America, as he likes to say. Well, you know what my 40 years have taught me? That you can't do that stuff until you clean out the routinized corruption in Washington. And that must be the first order of business when we win this election.
Well, I would tell you, you can dream on with that, because if you wanted a candidate to run against corruption, that candidate just unfortunately suspended his campaign with half the primaries left to go and endorsed this Joe Biden, who is completely senile and also, in my opinion, very corrupt. I mean, he's taken money from the credit card industry, from the supporters of Israel, from the health insurance industry. And today it was announced that Joe Manchin endorsed him after he got assurances from Biden that he would take care of the energy industry in his state. And we all know the energy industry in West Virginia is coal. And this is a guy who is against the Green New Deal, who's against Medicare for all, not because he's worried about electability, because 70% of the people who voted for him in the states support Medicare for all, and climate change is a major concern of the Democratic Party electorate. He's against those positions because his corporate donors wouldn't let him. And that's why he assured them at a fundraiser that nothing will fundamentally change. So I really feel that Joe Biden is not the best carrier for this message, despite what you just articulated.
Well, should he falter, I would think that Elizabeth Warren would be an excellent messenger for this message. And in fact, it was her message. And she did say, and I think this is what any Democrat should say, whether running for president or any office, that ultimately it's a little premature to talk about Medicare for more versus Medicare for all, or the exact magnitude of a Green New Deal, because the system we have now means that the US Senate or the Congress will never vote for anything that comes even close to those reforms. So it's a good place to start. Corruption, clean government is the foundational issue. It's the problem that makes other problems seem intractable.
Well, I don't think we can count on Elizabeth Warren either. She voted, and so did Bernie, for this horrible bailout, this corporate bailout, which was really even worse than the bailout from after the financial collapse. And she didn't even stand up for the four things that she pointed out that was wrong with this bailout. She just caved and voted for it, just like Bernie. So we've reached the end of our time on my show. I just want to give you the last word if there's anything you want to add about Donald Trump and his corruption, and what you think we in the public can do about this.
Well, my impression is that corruption has often turned out to be the point of greatest weakness of authoritarian and oligarchic regimes around the world. And when the moment comes that they can no longer hide it, when it's common knowledge, you either have to revert to autocracy, or the regime collapses. And so I say seize the Trump moment. Make this the time to blow the whistle, because I'm afraid that 4 more years is 4 more years to cement their hold on power and rig the electoral system even more strongly in favor of the Republican Party than it is now. There is a chance of bringing this regime down this year. And I think there is a chance of bringing it down with a resounding message of, we want systemic change.
Well, you got the wrong candidate bearing that, that message. I do think, however, as angry as I am with Bernie Sanders for doing what he did, and as much as I have tweeted out, never Biden, never Trump this week, I live in a swing state. I mean, I don't live in a swing state,
Right.
so I always get to vote for who I want, and I'm probably going to vote for Howie Hawkins, even though he has no chance. But I love the Green Party's platform. I had him on my show. He's a great individual and a great activist. But I do think that the biggest problems with continuing with the Trump administration are, of course, these things that I've talked about with the environment. Because even Obama, even though he quadrupled fracking, and even though Hillary Clinton took $680,000 from the fossil fuel industry, and Trump had a fundraiser from, hosted by a fossil fuel industry executive, I do think that those two, Clinton and Biden, would not have dismantled these regulations, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the fuel economy standards. I mean, it's really horrific what's happening with the environment that is irreversible. The other issue is the courts. I had been saying that, he already has a 5-4 majority, and those 5 are very young in terms of SCOTUS years, but it's not just the Supreme Court, it's also the lower courts. And there's a wonderful documentary, for those who haven't heard of this before. Frontline did a documentary called Supreme Revenge, and it's about Mitch McConnell's 30-year effort to take over the courts. And he's been extremely successful at that. So it's not just the Supreme Court, it's the lower court. And again, Democrats have been complicit in confirming these nominees who are no longer vetted by the American Bar Association, but by the Federalist Society, which is a very right-wing fundamentalist organization. And that is, I think, probably the 2 biggest reasons why I have to reluctantly, say any of my followers, viewers or followers in a swing state should hold their nose and vote for Biden. And this is the first time I'm saying this, but as we're talking about all the things that Trump has done, and I think about these 2 areas, I really can in good conscience tell people to give us, 4 more years of him, because I think you're right. I think he's cementing power. And I know I've had people from Refuse Fascism on my show. They're very concerned about his authoritarian nature. and that we are in or could be in a fascist situation. So we're going to leave it at that. I'm going to just promote my upcoming show on Saturday with Shama Sawant, who is a local city council member in Seattle, a fantastic activist. And she's going to be talking about an article that she just published in Teen Vogue today, advocating for rent strikes on May 1st. After Bernie left, I decided to go back to being an activist like I was during Occupy and after Occupy. And I really feel like the electoral process is just so corrupted by the influence of money in politics that we really need to get back to direct action. And right now with this pandemic, we have a situation that we haven't seen in 100 years, since the Spanish flu of 1918. We're going to have 25, 30% unemployment like we haven't seen since the Great Depression. And it's really an opportunity for people to do major things outside of the electoral system, such as rent strikes, student debt strikes, and general strikes. So I've got Shama on the show on Saturday. I've got Priscilla Grimm from Occupy Wall Street, who's has her website, coronastrike.us, talking about rent strikes in New York. I'm looking into getting Callie Acuna from Cooperation Jackson, who's got a call for a general strike on May 1st, and other people moving along these lines. This is what I'm going to be working on. So I want to thank you very much, Jim, for being on the show and for your excellent work. I've put the link to your article in the comments of the show. Is this going to be a live map? Are you going to keep contributing to it?
We are going to do our best to keep it up to date, and you know, the Trump administration will do its best to supply us with fresh crimes on a more or less daily basis.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. Please share this show. If this is the first time you've watched me, you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel, Lauren from LA, or follow me on Twitter, Lauren_Steiner. And you can follow Jim at James Lardner. And yeah, so stay safe, stay home, and keep fighting.
You too.